Hello everyone, welcome to Green Jobs for All as part of the Health for a Green New Deal gathering. It's great to see you all here. Thank you so much for joining the session. I know we had healthy air on the other side, so it was a really tough call because that's also a really important area. My name's Tess, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm in the MEDAC Climate and Health group. The call for green new jobs interests me because as a GP, I spend loads of time talking to people about their work, and it's striking how much work, lack of it, can affect people's health. The right work can give people financial stability, friendship, self-worth, opportunity to create and achieve, but poor quality work, unemployment and underemployment can make people feel stressed, anxious, depressed, or even physically ill. With unemployment rates set to soar in the wake of COVID-19, it's vital that governments intervene and create jobs and protect livelihoods. But jobs that only lead to more emissions and don't pay enough to live on are not the solution. In this session, we'll be exploring the need to create millions of well-paid, secure, green jobs as part of a just transition to zero carbon society. And we'll also look at what we mean by green jobs and how they relate to sectors such as health and care. And we're incredibly grateful to the panelists who are joining us today. Thank you so much for coming. To format the discussion, we're going to explore the themes by using some guiding questions, and that's over the next 40 minutes. There's 6 questions, so I reckon we've got about 5-6 minutes each. And then we're going to open up to questions from participants. If you've got a question, please put it in the chat and we'll put all the questions together and we'll return to them at the end. Right, so I'm going to introduce the speakers now and then we'll get going. So we've got Rachel Ambrose. Hello, Rachel. Rachel is a mental health nurse and Nurses United leader. She is passionate about inclusion, neurodiversity and anti-racism, and co-founded the Nurses of Colour Network as part of her work with Nurses United. We've got Danni Paffard. Danni is head of organising at Green New Deal UK. Prior to Green New Deal, she led the UK work for 350 Degrees org, including developing and supporting rapidly growing fossil fuel divestment movement. She was part of initiating the Direct Action Network UK Uncut, fighting austerity and corporate tax avoidance, brought airport expansion into the public consciousness as part of the Heathrow 13, and organised with local communities and activists against fracking. Wow. We've got Ryan Morrison. Ryan Morrison is the Just Transition campaigner at Friends of the Earth Scotland. Prior to that, Ryan worked for Stop Climate Chaos Scotland. Ryan is currently working on industrial and energy strategy, workers' rights, and how we can move to a fairer society while shifting away from a dependency on fossil fuels. And Tahir Latif was a member of the National Executive Committee of the Public and Commercial Services Union, PCS, and also president of the PCS Aviation Group. Losing his job due to the pandemic's impact on aviation workers, he's now secretary of the Greener Jobs Alliance, a member of the Campaign Against Climate Change Trade Union Group, and a co-author of the report, A Green New Deal for Gatwick. So welcome to all our speakers. I'm going to start with the first question now. The first question is, what are the health impacts of unemployment and low-paid, poor quality and precarious work? And I think, would Rachel like to start on that one?
Yeah, I'm happy to start.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tess. So yeah, as a nurse, I've been a nurse for like 15 years now, so this isn't something that's new. It's something that has kind of always run through how we think about health. I've worked as a mental health nurse and as a school nurse in public health as well, and often we find a lot of our referrals into healthcare, there's an underlying impact of kind of financial implications that lead on to a lot of health issues. So whether that is that, you know, some of these multiple layers, it can be through stress of kind of not having that secure work. It can impact on kind of their sorry, I'm getting a little bit tongue-tied. It can impact also, obviously, someone that doesn't have access to, say, the same foods as well, with considering people maybe having to make that choice between getting fruit and vegetables or getting those cheaper, bulkier products like white sliced bread, and making those kind of distinctions. Some families haven't had to do that, whereas others have, and for a long time as well. I think it's highlighted a lot more in the media at the moment as well. I think that COVID has highlighted that. We've seen those disparities that have happened, and that often people on lower incomes and people of colour have been impacted a lot more because of COVID and because of those financial implications. And I think this is finally kind of getting out there into the mainstream, and is rather than it being under the radar. So I suppose that's one positive that has come out of COVID, the fact that we are talking about it and being a lot more honest now.
Anyone else like to come in? No? Okay, should we move on to the next question then? So, how has COVID-19 highlighted injustices in what we value as work and of people's working conditions? I thought Tahir might like to start on that one from a union perspective.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Tess, and thank you everybody for attending. So first thing I should say, you probably gathered from my introduction that I have nothing to do with the health industry in any shape or form. So I speak from a position of complete ignorance in that respect. But I think there are some general principles about the workforce across the whole economy, really, that apply to all areas. I think in terms of the impact of the pandemic, what it has done is it's kind of left us in a sense, it's kind of brought the rest of the workforce much closer to the gig economy and the precariousness of employment, in the sense that we're all, regardless of where we work, and I worked in aviation, which was in an area that was reasonably skilled and well respected, etc., in conventional terms, but nevertheless, huge swathes of workers are either in that industry either redundant or at least on furlough at the very minimum. Just shows how precarious we are, and when it comes to the impact of a crisis like this, that's the situation that we face. I think, Tess, you mentioned about you kind of alluded to this in the sense that it does speak to the fallacy of leaving everything to the market, and that actually you need a government to come in and plan and coordinate things, certainly in some areas possibly more than others, but you cannot deal with a crisis of the scale and the type that we have at the moment without government intervention. I think that at the moment, regardless of how the current government is kind of basking in the glow of rolling out its vaccine program, nevertheless, it's failing on many other fronts through a complete absence of leadership. It's quite a simple equation, really, isn't it? We have a chronic need for a workforce in all sorts of areas, the healthcare being one of them, but also in education, in transport, in energy, etc. We need to transform, either add jobs. Well, you need to both add jobs and transform jobs in order to kind of meet the challenges that lie ahead. So there's a huge need for labour, and we have a huge swathe of labour that's currently not doing anything because it's been put out of work and is sitting at home either unemployed or on furlough, as I say. It doesn't take, it's not rocket science to say we need to bring those two things together and match them up as much as possible. A lot of those workers have skills which are very valuable and could be utilised for positive good, and others may need retraining and redeployment. Those are the kind of plans that we need to put in, and those are plans which we in the trade union movement, we've been trying to demand those things of the government to come out with a plan. In the absence of that kind of leadership, we've been doing it on a local and regional basis. You mentioned the Green New Deal for Gatwick report, and that's kind of a typical of the kind of local community-based activity that we're trying to generate, where we actually try and match up the needs of local communities in all aspects with the skills of the workforce, or the numbers of workers who are available perhaps to meet those needs. these are kind of very obvious and basic points that we seem to be systematically missing at the moment. So I think, without wanting to go on about it too much, that we're at a crossroads really as a result of the pandemic. Essentially, lots of people are out of work. On the one hand, the employers, corporate employers, see it as an opportunity because they think, well, when we recover, we can do it with less workers and we don't have to go through those years of nasty negotiation that we would have had to do otherwise. We just take back the numbers that we want, and so that kind of saving them costs in labour. But for us, it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to kind of reorient the workforce towards the kind of activities that we need to see to build a better society, and that means both in terms of meeting the shortage of public and social services, of being prepared for crises such as these. We've been exposed as not being prepared, and of course, above all, to meet the challenge of climate change in all its aspects and through all the activities that we need to do. So I think that's where we are, Tess, and I'll leave it there for the moment.
So you've spoken very powerfully there about people who have lost work as a result and having their skills unused. How about people, has anyone got anything to say about people who've continued to work and how we value the work of people who are chronically underpaid, our nurses, our healthcare workers, our people who we've seen as key workers and we've clapped for? Can anyone talk a bit about COVID and that aspect?
Yeah, Tess, I'd like to come in on this part. So obviously we have, I think as a public and the government as well, have realised how important nursing is. But obviously alongside that, we've got kind of the arguments going around about pay. So the government have been happy to clap for nurses, but actually when it comes to giving a fair wage rise, considering everything that's happened particularly over my career, over the last 15 years, those kind of real-time pay cuts that we've seen, they're not actually happy to put their money where their mouth is and pay for something that we need. There's a lot of money going around and investment going into quite wealthy businesses to try and do things differently, but actually there's already a need that's certainly been identified because of COVID in particular, and we need to be funding that, and we need to be supporting the staff, making sure that we've got adequate PPE. We're coming out of a peak at the moment, but we know there's potentially going to be a third, fourth, multiple peaks. We need to make sure that staff are protected from that. We know how particularly healthcare staff were disproportionately affected because they had to go to work. They couldn't be furloughed at home. We haven't seen that in schools, but who's to say that that's not going to change again? Those teachers are being forced into schools with children, and we're seeing mutations happening with the strains of COVID. Bus drivers, all those key workers that, it wasn't just healthcare, it was key workers who were clapping for. It was those people in supermarkets, like my mum, that was on the till, that didn't have her screen up initially, that didn't have a security guard there to stop people coming in without their masks on. It's those real people in real jobs on the ground that have had that inequality. And I think moving forward, if we're starting this conversation, we need to really be thinking about how we support them, as well as, like Tahir said, looking at kind of other opportunities and other ways of working. But yeah, that's what I'd like to say.
Perfect. Anyone else? No? Yeah. Right.
I might just come in quickly. I was in the fortunate position of being able to work from home quite quickly and relatively seamlessly when the pandemic started. I think I also sit on a branch within Unite, my trade union, which includes not just charity workers, but care workers and social care. And that was quite a really sort of grounding pattern to kind of go back to, that essentially I was kind of relatively comfortable and able to do my work from home, and I would join these conversations with people who worked in care who were not getting PPE, were outrageously overworked, expected to do more than they had done before in order to provide some of that care. And actually, the kind of more egregiously, we'd had a promise for care workers in Scotland that they would get a pay rise that would be backdated, that Scottish Government never put forward or never provided the money for local authorities to actually provide. And it took the chasing of kind of the branch officials within our sector to get them to do that. And you think it's when that the valuing dynamic is one thing, and obviously claps on the street and key workers, that sort of thing is, I think it was nice for most people, and it was a positive message of support. And I think now, what we kind of need to see, and what I hope we can see, will be more of that backing of when actually their demands are coming now. They want better pay and they want better conditions. And now, instead of clapping on the street, we throw our weight behind those demands with them and say, yeah, we did respect what you did, and we respect that it should never have been managed in the way that it was. So now we're behind you in this. And I think that's true of care workers who are now looking for sort of £15 an hour in national care services and sectoral bargaining. And it's true of nurses who are looking for similar like pay rises and 15 sort of minimum pay guarantees. I just wanted as well, I think Tahir mentioned the potential for endemic insecurity and that to be sort of now entrenched, or to reduce your workforce now having managed to operate at a lower level. And I think I just talk about people who work in the energy sector as a pretty incredible example of that. We took some time at the start of the pandemic to run a survey of people who worked in oil and gas offshore. And from that, heard that nearly half of them who responded, we spoke to approximately about 5% of the workforce, heard from them through the survey. And they nearly half of them had been furloughed or made redundant. And when we sort of dug into that a bit, had deeper conversations with them, what we found out was that over the last decade, over several decades, working conditions in that sector had become increasingly precarious, that the industry had sort of pivoted conditions away from permanent employees towards self-employment, and people being on much more short-term contracts brought in through recruitment agencies. And that meant that whenever a downturn happened, whenever something came up, they were much easier to let go of. And actually that had then a double impact, where those people then also didn't qualify for furlough initially, because they were just let go, and they didn't qualify for a lot of support because they'd essentially been made redundant rather than sort of kept on furlough when that was an option. That was something that we had heard was not related to the pandemic. That had been a trend that had been happening for years and years. And I think it's very true that sectors, there's a level of precarity that we know in some sectors like health and care and an undervaluing, but that this is becoming quite a trend. And I think we saw it with fire and rehire as well. Actually, the environment in the UK is currently going so far one way in favour of companies and big business to be able to drop and pick up a workforce as and when they choose, with very little pay and protection. And it's something that needs fixed across the economy.
All right. So we've talked there a lot about the need for these green jobs. So in the context of the health impacts, how COVID-19 has highlighted injustices and connected to climate breakdown, why do we need green jobs? Well, we've touched on why we need them, but what do they look like?
I can come in on this one.
Thanks, Danni.
So I think, yeah, like why we need them is pretty clear. And I think it's, yeah, a combination of like looking at, we're looking down the barrel of an unemployment crisis similar to the deindustrialization of the 80s. And, FO have done some, Friends of the Earth have done some really good work on the kind of the disproportionate impact, particularly on young people, particularly on already kind of like demographic sectors already pretty excluded from the workforce, and the kind of scarring impact that will have, as well as the need to transform the entire economy in the face of the climate crisis. And I think couldn't agree more with Tahir about the need for this to be a like real kind of government driven program. This needs to be a serious like investment and kind of calculated approach. And I think when we compare investment in the UK with other countries, if you look at kind of Biden's 3 trillion commitment to kind of green stimulus and Boris Johnson's 3 billion in his 10-point plan of new spending, we can see the huge like disparity of what's happening kind of in this country. And in terms of what those jobs look like and what we need to be what we should be investing in. So as Green New Deal UK, which is the organisation that I work for, we released a report in November looking at the kind of potential for job creation to match COVID job losses, and we looked at with a kind of 68 billion investment at kind of 1.2 million jobs that could be created in the next 2 years. And the types of jobs we were talking about, so this was just kind of pulling in like amalgamating data that already existed, and there were 2 specific types of jobs that we looked at, and the first was green infrastructure and all the things that we will need to like create and build and transform and retrofit our homes and build public transport and kind of more infrastructure investment to kind of transition our economy. But the other type of work we looked at was care work, and how we can like really systematically invest to tackle the kind of climate crisis, the unemployment, and the crisis in care all at the same time. And we looked at those two particular sectors, but I think if there had been more data available, we would have gone further. And I think the point there really is that when we think of kind of when we think about green jobs, people think chaps with hard hats building solar panels, and that's absolutely a kind of narrative that we need to move away from, because that's not helpful in a kind of post-carbon economy. We're properly valuing our care workers, our nurses, our health givers, our education givers, and that's a really important part of what a green job is ultimately. And obviously we need the like big investment now in the transformation of society to be low carbon, but like ultimately where that leaves us is with our carers and our health givers and our educators in kind of prime position. And so I think our report is like fairly limited in only looking at the huge investment we need in care work, but green jobs must extend to those wider sectors as well. And we need to, if it's going to be like ultimately sustainable, we need to be talking about like good green jobs as well, and the nature, the quality, the pay of the jobs we're calling for. So yeah, that's what a green job should look like from our point of view.
Anyone else like to come in there? I thought maybe Tahir, because there was lots of calls for, there were quite a lot of specifics in your report about the sorts of jobs you wanted, I think.
Yeah, I was going to stand back and let other people come in, but I mean, I think really the thing is that what Danny's outlined there and what the report outlines is just the sheer diversity of the types of jobs that are needed, and it is across a huge spectrum. Now, when you think about it, given that situation, how can you justify anyone being in unemployment or sitting at home doing nothing? Because we can all have a job. We talk about don't want to go down a different tack, but we sometimes talk about automation and gosh, what are people going to do? We need universal basic income and all those kind of things. But actually, there's a whole range of jobs that need doing first before you even get to that situation, and we need, and there are people out there to do them. So it's a simple match-up in that respect, and the government has to take responsibility for providing where the people and the jobs don't match up, for actually providing the means by which that can actually happen, so that we can fulfill our needs as a society.
Anyone else like to come in on there? Yeah.
After you, Rachel. Sorry, you unmuted first.
Thank you, Ryan. I would just echo what everyone else has said, absolutely, but I would just like to add kind of the voice for those unpaid carers as well. I think we've definitely seen through the course of the pandemic how important that role is, whether it's parents caring for children, whether it's those caring for friends and relatives with learning disabilities, like our elderly as well. We've seen how when people have to leave their home environments and go into kind of care facilities and care homes, that actually they haven't been able to have that support of their family, and that's had a really negative impact. You know, families have been split up for the course of this past year. I think even now some care homes only allow one family member in to see their relatives, which is absolutely shocking. But if we are able to kind of ensure that we do value those unpaid care roles, then that could make sure that people can stay in their own homes for longer, with the support of their loved ones around them. And I think that's something maybe that the universal basic income, that discussion around that, the discussion around paying for our carers, maybe that's something that is going to be able to happen a lot more in the future, without us having to rely on an industry really that is you know, charging really high fees for care that family members want to give themselves but often get really burnt out, and they don't have access to the respite that they need. And I think it's time that we change that and we start thinking about those things much more differently as well.
Thank you, Rachel. Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, I really agree with what everyone said as well, and I think that was a good shout to unpaid carers too. In the context of why we need green jobs, I think it's important to sort of reflect on the reality that to do anything other than that is to create work and invest in industries that are inherently precarious, because we will then know we need to make a plan for phasing them out or winding them down in response to the climate crisis. It's a sort of a logical step if you want to create work that is sustainable and secure for people in the long run, that sort of local communities can rely on as well. But to do that without prioritising and thinking about their environmental impact is just to embed yet more insecurity for people further down the line quite soon. And I think when I think about green jobs, and this is absolutely by no means an inevitability, because it's certainly not the case now. Like in my own head, I think about jobs that are more secure and that are sort of better protected, better paid, and that's partly because I think in tackling climate crisis and creating these jobs, to do so, we're sort of getting to the core root of the problem that led us here, that essentially it was deregulation of both environmental protections and working conditions that lead us to a place where we are close to climate breakdown, but also people's work and jobs are undervalued and they are overworked and dealing with insecure terms and conditions. So that means, in my opinion, in my head, if we're creating green jobs, that means we are changing the onus and prioritizing industries not based on profit, but based on what we need to see in the future. That also means that we're looking at how we do that for workers too, and making sort of sustainable working lives and thriving lives as well. I think there was an interesting report from a group involved in the United Nations Environmental Programme that looked at government support to fossil fuel industries across the globe in response to the pandemic. The UK came one of the highest in terms of financial investment, and that's not in itself a bad thing in supporting an industry that is struggling at a time. But the big thing that was missing was that a lot of that support was came with absolutely zero conditionality on it. So there was an opportunity, as an industry was looking for support, a polluting industry, one that needs to be wound down. They needed government investment to sustain themselves through the pandemic. And instead of tying conditionality to that said, right, we will give you this investment, but we need to see decarbonisation. We need to see you winding down your production. We need to see you creating pathways for your workforce into new industries. And we want to see you recognising trade unions in the process. Actually, those were just handouts where we didn't do any of that. And so instead of giving ourselves that head start, as we come out of the pandemic, being able to create those pathways and new opportunities, we did the reverse and just continued to hand out money to big business. And I think that's where we get to the root of why we need green jobs, because we need to tackle that sort of unwillingness to take the reins and manage the process and manage our industries, essentially.
That's great, Ryan. Thank you. I think something that often doesn't get touched on is that, look, the emission heavy industries are going to wind down anyway. You know, we can't ignore, you know, climate change will happen and we will have to wind them down. So these jobs aren't secure anyhow. And it shouldn't be an argument between, you know, it shouldn't be environment or jobs, you know, they can work together. You did touch on this a little bit earlier, Danni, but I wondered if you wanted to enlarge any more. Are care jobs green jobs?
Absolutely. Yeah, 10 out of 10, good green job. You know, kind of high labour input, zero emissions, fundamental to the kind of economy that we want to build, that's based on looking after people, yeah, and I think it's really important, like what kind of Rachel brought to the table about like unpaid care as well, and how we like really support, how we build the infrastructure that supports that and like recognises that and cherishes that, particularly as, you know, so heavily skews to women that deliver that. So yeah, I think you know, care jobs are 100% green jobs, and what we need to be like valuing and supporting, and really like you know, I think the care sector is a really important one to like bring into this narrative more firmly, especially around good green jobs, because there are lots of really bad, underpaid, insecure care work, and that is not a green job. And so I think we need to, as we like expand the definition of what green means, we need to ensure that that means like kind of low carbon and sustainable and caring in the long run, and also good quality. And I think that, so I think with care jobs, there's a double fight, there's a double challenge in kind of integrating that into our narrative. And the first is like changing, you know, because if lots of people, if you say like, is care job a green job? I don't think we're at the point where people will be like, yes, absolutely. And like, that's the kind of narrative shift that we need to make. And secondly, we need to be like, well, not yet. The fight we need to have is making sure they are good green jobs. And that's what's integral to them being green as well, because that's like core to kind of social and environmental sustainability. So yes, absolutely, care jobs are green jobs. And I think, you know, as this campaign develops, we also need to work, you know, it's not just care jobs, it's also teaching and health and, you know, the full gamut of those kind of sustainable economy jobs. And I think, you know, care is, you know, from our point of view, care is just the starter of that conversation. And I think we particularly value our relationship with MedAct and the kind of health community as a way to kind of build that narrative even further around, like, you know, expand what people understand of what a green job is. So yes to care, and is what I would say.
Fabulous, thank you. And what a green job is, and what green is, and what health is, I suppose, as well. You know, because it's not just doctors and nurses, is it? It's your environment and your work and everything. Rachel, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I don't think there's much to add really on that one. I think we all here agree that health jobs are definitely green jobs. We know it provides like a net positive to society, to our planet, to all of us. And I think it's just a case of us ensuring that the people that are putting the investment in also value it as well, in either monetary terms or in terms of what they're saying as well. Because recent as last year, I know our Home Secretary was saying that nursing jobs weren't skilled jobs, and it's that kind of background to kind of talking about healthcare and how we value and care for our society, that needs to shift as well. and not just seeing like banking and investment as what they need to focus on because that brings back more money. Actually, it's how we're able to enjoy our lives and thrive as well. And very often that starts with kind of those essentials and those necessities to the kind of building blocks of life. And definitely health jobs can support that. So yeah, I'd agree with everything else that Danni brought to the table there as well.
Lovely. So the next question is, how do we ensure that a Green New Deal enables a just transition for workers? And how might it change what we value as work? And that touches on what you were saying about, you know, how do we measure the benefit from health, and also what Ryan was saying earlier about the just transition for the heavy industry workers. So Ryan, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I mean, I think at the minute, what we're probably lacking is just a really clear sense of direction for most of these industries, the most heavily polluting ones. I think we're at a point where the UK government wants to kind of continue to hand out new licenses for oil exploration that can last for 30 years, not including the actual length of time they spend production. That, when you think about it, just seems like palpably unbelievable that we would be kind of carrying on that trend when we know that there's kind of really rapid emissions reductions that needs to happen this decade, and that includes winding down our fossil fuel production essentially. And I think then really in ensuring a just transition for workers through a Green New Deal, it's, in my opinion, about giving power to those workers in the industry to then shape that transition process and the alternative industries that they might look to move into instead. And it's a challenging process. Like, it's certainly not it's not something that you can do on a whim or with just sporadic measures every now and again. Like, it requires exactly what Danni mentioned before. Like, it requires that industrial plan. It requires a vision, a direction, and then the commitment to back it up with policy and investment. And particularly if you want it to happen in a coherent sort of strategic way, where there are specific regions and areas and sites of kind of key employment. So you think about Aberdeen in the northeast, but you also think about Tees Valley and down in the Humber, for instance, these places where there are pockets of employment and industry that are really dependent on fossil fuels. And to do that process properly, you need to be able to see them, to analyze it, to work out what could come instead. And I mean, I think we often talk about bad examples of deindustrialization, and the obvious examples come up of coal and shipbuilding industries, textiles even, these sorts of sectors. But I think at the minute we can see some of this playing out now, that essentially there has been a growth in renewable energy generation in the UK, but there hasn't been the full extent of possible benefits captured here that we should have seen. And actually it's been energy communities that have suffered as a result. And so you can, like, I've got a few examples. Like, if you look at, there's an electric bus manufacturer called Alexander Dennis in Falkirk. Last year, they were facing hundreds of job cuts. There's a company called CS Wind, which is the UK's only turbine tower manufacturer in Campbelltown in Argyll on the west coast of Scotland. And that's set to be closed. And then the kind of much more widely reported and long-running battle for BIFAB that was led by workers and their trade unions, that's only this weekend seen positive news of 300 jobs. Like, each of those sites should be right now seeing incredible growth. We need more electric buses because we need to replace the diesel fleet, but we also need to grow public transport. So we just need more buses. We need more wind tower turbines. And we need to support those industries where they are already. I mean, BIFAB's the perfect example, because those fabrication yards essentially working with massive steel and massive structures used to provide the same structures for oil rigs. So you had this perfect example of a company that was able to transfer that work, those skills and that experience from oil and gas into renewables and offshore wind turbine jackets. And instead of them benefiting from what has been growth in renewable energy capacity and what is now likely to be more renewable energy capacity, actually they really struggled, and the site went into administration. It's just on the east coast, essentially, of Scotland, 40 miles away from some of the biggest wind farm sites that are set to be developed, and it has really struggled to get even a portion of that work. And what it's been is essentially the organising of the workers with their trade unions and the support of their local communities with many climate activists that has meant that those sites have been secured, with the exception of CS Wind. Alexander Dennis has been awarded bus contracts now, eventually, quite close to the election, which I am cynical of, but glad it's happened. But we've not dealt with the systemic issue there. So there's no strict requirements yet in place for an offshore wind developer to have to use local supply chains. So although there's been this capturing of a part of a contract for BIFAB for an offshore wind farm, actually that hasn't been spread across the full process. There's a contracts with difference subsidy where there's an opportunity to put that in, and it's still not clear that that's going to happen. And that process, making those sort of changes happen, seems just quite sensible, that where we are going to have companies using building new renewable energy, that it makes sense to be able to use local supply chains, and not just to encourage that, but to just make it a requirement. It's kind of, we have companies in the UK that are fighting for contracts against the state-backed companies of other governments. So across the UK, in our wind farms, over 50% of those wind farms are owned by the publicly owned companies of other governments. Well, at the same time, there's only one turbine in the UK that is owned by, and that's just one turbine, not even a farm, that's owned by a UK equivalent. We are uniquely badly placed to make that happen. And I think that's where a Green New Deal can enable a just transition, is by saying, okay, we're going to bring workers and their trade unions and local communities into these discussions. We're going to frontline that for these industries where we know there's a challenging process ahead, and give them power to shape that. I think that we've seen good examples of workers and their trade unions leading transition processes in Canada with the Coal Commission, even in Spain with the closure of coal mines, where there was really specific just transition action plans. And so I think that's really, that in the context of the Green New Deal, when we're talking about those industries which we know need to be wound down and that are particularly highly polluting, that's what it's about, in my opinion, is speaking to the workforce, speaking to their trade unions, getting them involved in the conversation. That report I mentioned before, one of the questions we asked them was about the energy transition and what did you think needed to happen? I mean, those people had worked in the industry for decades. They know what needs to happen. They knew what wasn't working. They knew why they couldn't get into renewables. They knew what the problems were there. And they knew how to move from oil and gas to a renewable energy system, because it's their job and it's their skills, their expertise. It's handing power over to them to let them guide that process and shape what the industry is that they want to move into, really. And I will stop there. That was quite long, sorry.
Come on, Danni.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with all of that. And I think on how do we guarantee this? I think there are two elements that we need to work on. And I think the first is how do we fully encapsulate a just transition in the things that we're asking for? And so how does the things that we want include that no one gets left behind? And as a movement, we are really aligned that transitions have to happen and nobody gets left behind in this transition. And secondly, the new world, absolutely rigorous about the higher standards for work that the green transition demands, and be very propositional about the sort of industries we want to support and be transitioning to. So I think there's the first piece of work about embedding the just transition is being really aligned and solid as a movement about what that means. And I think particularly the green movement has been disappointing, historically on kind of workers' rights, some elements of the green movement on workers' rights, and I think we're past that time, and that's really brilliant that this is now so much more embedded in the kind of the call for environmental and social justice being fully intertwined. So that's really great. That's the first thing we need to do. Obviously, the second thing we need to do is win it. And the reality is we're a million, we can say what we want, and we're a million miles away from the UK government listening to anything, basically. So I think, there's a definition and a kind of identity, container building piece, and then there's a strategy piece about okay, and how do we win it? And I think the really interesting thing about this piece of work and what Ryan was saying is that we are the strategic fight that we are building is one that has workers and, you know, at the core of it, and their knowledge and their skills, and like them leading the charge. And so I think there's a really, you know, in that kind of bringing everyone in, broadening the container, making sure it works for everyone, I think there's a strategic kind of campaigning piece around how that builds the breadth of movement and the kind of diversity and the voices in the movement that need to be there to make sure that we build the kind of systemic power that means that we can kind of push this agenda with a hostile government in these times. So I think there's like, you know, there's a definitional and a strategic piece as to like how we make that happen.
Fantastic. Did Tahir or Rachel want to comment in that one before we move on?
I'd just like to add like one other point to this, like thinking of the question, it made me think how we've kind of been given an opportunity that we haven't had as much previously prior to COVID. Just thinking about how we can open up the workspace now to a lot more people that previously there were barriers in place for. And particularly thinking about like how many more people are able to work from home. So a lot of people with particular disabilities found it difficult accessing work, travelling into work, and just being in that space sometimes as well. I'm thinking back to an Autism Oxford event that I went to, and it was run by some amazing guys who had autism, and they were particularly in kind of the tech field, and their value in that particular field from some employers was really appreciated. The way that they were able to hyper-focus and get those projects done. Their disability actually was seen as a real positive, and they were encouraged to work in that field. There was another guy that I will never forget who came on, and he was talking about his job working in a Lego shop, and he had a skill, and it was a real skill, of knowing from like those little character bags of Lego, he could tell you which character was in this bag of Lego just from feeling it. And that's not something that anyone can learn. Like, that was a fantastic skill, and his employer had embraced that. And I think hopefully from COVID we can get to see our employers just opening up that workspace and inviting people in there that didn't have an opportunity previously. There's been a lot of talk in the past 12 months as well about those kind of racial disparities as well, and not actually being able to see people who look like you in those top jobs. Well, let's start to break down those barriers, and let's try and change that now. We've got this opportunity. It doesn't always have to stay the same, and we just have to, I think, be less precious and be able to open up those spaces a little bit more. So yeah, that was just a little bit extra I wanted to add.
Thank you. That was a lovely positive note there in a sea of what can sometimes feel a bit overwhelming. Tahir, did you want to add anything on just transitions?
Yeah, thanks. Apologies, I lost contact there, but took your advice about turning off and on again, so that worked. Yeah, so because I missed a few minutes there. Forgive me if I'm repeating something that anyone else has said, but just kind of prompted initially by Ryan's previous contribution. It is really just to kind of be realistic about how the term just transition does go down with a lot of workers and their unions, because you would think it's self-evident in the actual phrase itself. The idea is to do justice to those workers. But, you know, we do run up against a lot of opposition to those kind of, when we use that terminology, which, you know, you have to set it in the context of the fact that for the last 10, 11 years, we've had austerity economics, you know, the gig economy, precarious. work and so on, and people's fear, I think, of losing their jobs. We have to be honest about this. People's fear of losing their jobs is probably greater now than at any time in the past, because of just the nature of how it is at the moment. You're either going to fall into that situation where you need to do 2 or 3 jobs just to make any kind of money, or you're going to be unemployed and kind of demonized by society or by the media or whoever. And so that does kind of put up a huge barrier. People want to cling on to what they've got, regardless of what it is. And even if their own attitude may be completely in accordance with everything that we're saying at this meeting, they may still say, but yeah, but day to day, I need to do this in order to put bread on the table, kind of thing. So it is very difficult. And, you know, we have to develop arguments to kind of to kind of counter that view. And I think one thing is that it is the idea that security, job security, real job security, is actually implicit in the whole idea of green jobs, because I think the things that both Ryan and yourself, Tess, both touched on is the fact that it's no longer a case of environment versus jobs. In fact, the environment, climate change, etc., and all the things associated with that are actually the source of long-term job security. If you are in an industry, I mean, my own industry, aviation is a great example, of course, energy is the obvious one. Those things are going to change. So if you're oblivious to that, then you are not really looking at your long-term job security. And trade unions need to realise that when they align themselves with those kind of things like airport expansion and fracking and things, which unfortunately does happen because of their commitment to protect jobs in the short term. They actually need to look over the horizon and see what's coming. Say, how do we really act in the best interests of our members? What does that actually mean? But I think the thing that is missing, which you really need from a government, if you're really going to progress, is kind of job guarantee, and to actually say, do not have fear. You will have a job. It may be different to the one you have today, but you will have a job. I mean, that's the thing that. And let's be honest about it, the government we have is not going to give that. It's a struggle that we have to fight with over the next few years, I think.
Super. Right, so we're on to the last and I think the hardest question, which is, how do we do it? How do we organise for green jobs for a Green New Deal? I think, yeah, Danni, you were starting on that.
Okay, am I? Okay, great. I mean, it's a good, it's the big question, isn't it? So I think green jobs are good green jobs. I think so obviously we campaign holistically for a Green New Deal, which is a kind of, huge transformational project that involves a much more active role by the state, a total reorganization of ownership of how we own resources and how we use them, regulation of the financial industry, a whole kind of suite of things that are a total anathema to current government position. I guess, give or take some interesting shifts in level of public investment they're now interested in taking. So we've got this huge progressive agenda, and how do you move that forward in a time when the government isn't interested? And a huge part of the Green New Deal, as well as all of this stuff, is this massive job creation program and making it good and green. And strategically, we feel like this is the best, given the unemployment crisis, given the need to kind of mass green good stimulus to the economy. This is a strategic kind of triangulation point where we can kind of gain leverage and traction for ultimately a much bigger agenda through talking about good green jobs and kind of meeting the moment where it's at, in a way. And so I think that's why campaigning on good green jobs is kind of strategic and useful right now. In terms of how we do that, I think it's very clear that we are going to need to create an enormous amount of pressure on the government to deliver on that, particularly in the terms of, that meet our conditions of a good green job. And I think, so a couple of, kind of the components of that, I think the first is kind of building our shared base and alignment and vision. And I think that's, you know, that's why we're talking about like good green jobs and like making sure that like the trade unions are a firm part of this narrative and this agenda. It's why we're like expanding it to include care work and health work and kind of education, so that those sectors are part of this kind of fight and this push. So I would say, you know, the first element of fighting these jobs is building our shared base and our shared story and narrative, and, you know, building it with as wide a kind of grouping as possible, so that we're singing from the same hymn sheet. I think the kind of second is obviously like massively, you know, to create change, you need people power and you need political power, is our kind of analysis. And I think the first kind of step that we're on is about kind of socializing, you know, raising the profile of this concept amongst kind of the general public. And I think, you know, I guess so far we focused on a few like short-term interventions and are just at the moment thinking about like what the next steps in this strategy are. But I think some of the things that we've worked on, so joint with MedAct, was the storytelling action a few weeks back, where we encouraged people to share their story about why they're calling for good green jobs, and making sure that the suite of storytellers was across care, health, young people, unemployed people, like telling that story, sharing it. And 1 million people saw those videos on the 23rd of March. So that was our first kind of step into being like, how do we tell these stories, and how do we get people in our communities telling their story, sharing it with their community, and socializing this. And next week, so on Tuesday, we'll be releasing a lookup tool that in every constituency, you can look up your constituency and you can see how many green jobs could be created in your constituency if the government invested now. So it's very much like theoretical, if the government pulled their finger out, this is what, you know, your community specifically, and that's the green infrastructure and the care work. So we hope that, and we're sending out press releases to everyone, and like we hope that's part of kind of another media moment of building the narrative around getting people to understand what that means for them and why the government needs to be acting on this. So that's the next thing. And then on Thursday, we're launching an EDM. And so encouraging like, and this is going to be the first challenge to politicians to be like, are you with us or are you not? We're calling for green jobs across the country. And that's going to be a really interesting exercise in kind of, you know, I think particularly with the like, you know, the political dynamics around the red wall, this big fight about, you know, investing in good green jobs feels like a real sweet spot. And so that's, we're going to see how kind of building like political alignment around that EDM. Obviously, it then all gets cancelled by the Queen's speech in May, so we'll have to kind of rethink and start that again. But yeah, and then on the Saturday, there's going to be lots of people kind of taking action in a socially distanced way outside their MPs' offices in their constituencies, demanding green jobs. So that's just a few examples of like the type of things that we've got, you know, coming in the next week, and the type of things that I think we need to do to kind of build the social awareness, build the political power, the social power, and then the political power to be like, are you in or are you not? How do we make this a fight? How do we like, you know, take the ground on this? And, you know, so we'll be developing you know, more strategies around that, and, you know, hopefully working with the kind of health community as well as a kind of key voice in that space. And I think the other bit of the strategy that we really need to develop is like, and I think Scotland and Friends of the Earth are doing a really great job of this, like some of the stuff that they're building, like the alliance between like workers looking to lose their job and like the environmental and social movements kind of rallying in behind them and kind of creating a stronger force for change. So I think as we move to win this fight, like solidarity and allyship and kind of standing together are going to be a key part of how we make this work. So yeah, those are you know, these are difficult political conditions to be working in, but also I think, you know, as Rachel and some of the others have said, it's a really interesting narrative moment given what COVID has kind of cracked open for us in terms of like narrative around health and care, narrative around who matters, and narrative around public spending. So yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah, wow, fabulous. Anyone else got anything to add on organising and going forward? Yeah, thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, I have absolutely nothing really to add in any substantial way beyond what Danni just said, because I think she's absolutely hit the nail on the head, to be honest. I think that there are, it hasn't always been the case, and I think Danni touched on this earlier, that we've been able to kind of show that solidarity across issues, even where it's really been needed and kind of quite desperately needed and should have happened. And I think what we've tried to do in recent times is, I mentioned Alexander Dennis and the battle for BIFAB as sort of two areas where there were green industries that should have been growing and were struggling. And we did what we could at the time to kind of throw our efforts and our weight behind what the workers and the trade unions were demanding in those spaces, and then communicating that to our supporters. And I think that's probably one of the big steps that we're able to sit and agree and sort of share that analysis that we think these are shared struggles, and that it'll be us tackling them each at the same time that ultimately makes it possible to do it properly. And it's then about, okay, well, the next step in that is sort of being visible, and it goes a long way, I think. And I think Tahir is right that there is a distrust for many workers and for many people about what just transition means or what green jobs means and things like that. And I think partly what visibility can do is tackle some of that. You know, it's people that you then begin to know and see. Those issues don't seem quite as separate anymore, as that, again, that perception Danni mentioned of maybe the climate movement being a little bit aloof and a bit disconnected from work and struggle. And I think the way that changes is that actually those spaces become more intertwined and more connected, and that people who right now are largely involved in trade unions or working struggles become more involved in climate struggles, and vice versa. And it's that sort of cross-pollination that can have a much greater kind of snowball effect. And I think, I mean, Tahir mentioned as well, fracking is one of those issues where there's maybe some disagreement, where there's tension comes up, where there's an opportunity for jobs short term that then sort of pulls people in. And I think, and this is borne out with the experience that we've had with talking to offshore oil workers, is just that there is actually an incredibly huge portion that we agree on. And, you know, when it comes to some of these areas, there's only a small section, in my opinion, where there is real or any sort of substantive disagreement. And actually, it's a very convenient way to keep both of those groups apart, is to highlight and spotlight those contradictions and highlight where there's disagreement. And actually, it's much easier if we can continue to look at the areas where we agree and throw support behind them. And we do that through the Just Transition Partnership in Scotland with it's Friends of the Earth, and co-chaired by the Scottish Trade Union Congress, but with PCS and Unite and Unison on board as well. And we're able to talk about the things that we agree on in a really big way and throw our collective support behind them, and that's really helpful. And I'm going to use another example, just kind of going back a little bit, but there's this much discussed energy transition zone being proposed in an area outside of Aberdeen called Torry, and it's been used as an example of where we can create new jobs. And essentially it's the building of an industrial park on the only remaining green space of an area that is considered to be in a sort of significant multiple deprivation. And it's their local green space, their last remaining green space. They've given a lot away to the oil industry, including the harbour, and sort of knocked down old houses. A lot of old Torry is gone. And actually there's a local residents campaign there to resist that, to say we've had enough. Actually, we have a different vision for what our community looks like, and it's protecting the green space, it's enhancing it, it's making it a more enjoyable and accessible space for people who live here, rather than turning it into an industrial site. And I think Frank Bolton, I'm not sure if you're still on the call, but you mentioned about your high streets, and it's an ongoing pet peeve of mine that you see politicians kind of stood outside the opening of this massive new out-of-town shopping centre, and there'll be 100 jobs here and we're delighted, and getting the big press up. And as far as I'm aware, all evidence is that the consequences of those big out-of-town shopping centres is fewer jobs in the local economy, and it's a net loss. And actually, that's something that I think we can all get around together, because inevitably that big out-of-town shopping centre comes with a huge car park, it increases the reliance on private use cars, and it has horrendous climate impacts, and it's a poor use of resources. To be honest, this energy transition zone is an example of that. It's a bad use of resources when there is vacant industrial site nearby. Those are areas where I think there is huge agreement between us, and we can start to present our own vision if we're able to kind of unify and rally around it. And I guess Tahir said, you know, like the government isn't going to just give you this, isn't going to give us it, but no government ever has given anything to anyone. You know, it's an organising issue. This is something we need to coalesce round and fight for, and I think that's what we bring: different skills, different experience, the climate and trade union movement, and I think together it's a pretty powerful measure and a pretty powerful effort to do. And so I guess in the very specific, how do we organise? I'd say be seen together, be active, talk about the issues with yourselves, with amongst your colleagues, amongst people that you work with, join a trade union, be active in that trade union, push your elected representatives to understand these issues, like Danny's saying, when this tool comes out, like get involved and really go in and demand it, because I can guarantee you that on the other end of a phone call to those politicians, to the government, is a corporation, a big business looking for something much worse. And it's only when we're able to present something as a more united front that we will actually realise a Green New Deal or a just transition.
So there's a seamless transition onto the audience questions there. Fabulous. Has anyone else got anything to say either about the high street or about action for Green New Deal? Go to here.
Yeah, thanks. Just I absolutely totally agree with Ryan that the answer to the absence of leadership from the government is bottom-up movement. I mean, that's where the demands come from, and all, you know, it's a cliche, but all change comes from the bottom up, and that's how we have to do it. That does tie into the point that I was going to make, which is, and I apologise for labouring the point about the Gatwick Green New Deal report. It's not because I want to be an advert for it or anything, but it's a good example of something that is a basis for organising that I think has some power, in the sense that you take that area around Red Hill, Crawley, etc., Crawley often at the top of the unemployment tables. There's a real need there for a more diverse approach to employment, because it is very dependent on the airport. And so what the report does is look at the other sectors that are not addressed. Now that's resonated with the local communities. We've done quite a few meetings with people who have support the report. Local authorities are interested and actually want to talk to us, and MPs have laid down an early day motion about the report and trying to get MPs to sign up to the principle of it. And I think the reason for that is that at that smaller local level, you can actually see the benefits of doing these things. You can actually tie it directly to the actual real needs of your community and the people in it, in a way that the more abstract discussions at the national level can't do. You can actually see how things could be changed. Now we've had approaches, and we're working with Heathrow Airport campaigners and Leeds Bradford Airport campaigners about doing similar things in those areas. It doesn't have to be airports, of course, but basically it's rooted in local communities around those airports who recognise that actually there's a dearth of the services that they actually need, and instead it's all being funneled into, like bailout money being funneled into those corporations that actually are based at the airport, and that's not the way it should be working. But what I really get excited about when I hear some of those other areas coming to us and saying, yeah, we want to do something similar to that, is that at some point those will join up to create a kind of national demand, because it's not, you know, yes, it's all rooted in local communities, but the way that you get to a position where you're pressuring the government to do something is that you get a lot of communities, a lot of areas dotted around the country all doing these things and making these demands and saying, this is how we could transform our local economy and society and community. Now we need to do something bigger than that. It's the obvious next step. Just before I sort of sign off there, if there's a meeting next week, which I would encourage people to look up, 23rd to the 25th of April, From the Ground Up, which is discussing all these issues at quite a big level. If Ben doesn't have access to the link, I'll look it up now and provide it to you. So thank you very much.
Great, and that takes us to Ben wanted me to ask you all to let us know, how can we follow your work? How can we find out more? Rachel, do you want to start?
I think what everyone said so far has definitely been spot on. I suppose from a health perspective, and particularly nursing perspective, I would just highlight, like, we currently have over 40,000 vacancies, and the impact of the workload from COVID has been absolutely immense. So there are a lot of nurses that are burnt out at the moment and will probably be leaving the profession. There are a lot that are ready for retirement as well, so naturally will be leaving the profession. So as well as encouraging green jobs, nursing jobs, healthcare jobs, we need to think about how we support and care for those staff as well. So thinking about kind of safe staffing, making sure that we're not putting too much pressure and workload on our workforce. That needs to be kind of at the top of that agenda as well as having fair pay for the work that people are doing, and not just claps as we've had for this past 12 months. And I think kind of thinking about what Danni was saying about the red wall, as you can hear, I'm from the north, even though I work down south. I think, like, this has been an issue that has not just happened over the last few years. Like, it's been many governments of many colours that have just taken away a lot of that trust. I know, like, my husband and I, we moved after I'd qualified as a nurse. He's an engineer, and I remember a few years before we moved down south, like, the amount of times he was made redundant because his industry was going through so much change, and there wasn't enough funding in a lot of northern areas for the type of work he was doing, the type of engineering. It's either gone abroad or it's gone down south. It's not always considered as skilled anymore. They don't need those time-served engineers. And I think that really needs to change, because we've seen through the pandemic actually that kind of disruptions to supply chains, that we do need to be manufacturing things in this country as well. It's not always about getting it done for the cheapest price. We have to value all of our communities, and those high skilled jobs, you do have to pay a bit extra here, but it's proven, it's been a necessity that we have those things happening here. And then just touching a little bit on what Ryan said as well about kind of valuing our green spaces. I know, particularly in my area, we are going through a huge transformation because of East-West Rail and the new high-speed rail that's coming through here with HS2. And it doesn't feel like our green spaces are being valued at the moment. They're just being demolished, and it's rarely discussed really in the media. There's going to be a massive impact on the environment, but also going back to health, on our mental health. We all saw how important it was last year to get out into green spaces, to be able to exercise. And yeah, I fear kind of going forward. I know this year when we go on walks, it's not going to look the same at all. All those woodlands have been cut down, and you can't access a lot of kind of the public walkways because of all the extra building work that's happening because of HS2. And I think, yeah, we just really need to look at that before it gets too far down the line and they can't change anything. Like, there is an opportunity to backtrack a bit. We know that people are not commuting into London as much anymore. So do we need to rethink those things? But yeah, it's been a really great event, and thank you for inviting me to have my say on some of these issues.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So we're going to have to wind up now, although it'd be lovely to stay here longer, but I'm sure we could all talk an awful lot longer. But thanks ever so much. Thank you so much to all the panelists for speaking and for the audience for their contributions. I've been really struck. There's been lots of really great positive ideas, a really diverse range of perspectives from the different panelists, but lots of agreement. And I just wanted to say I've been really impressed by the clarity of language as well. It's all been so accessible without jargon and to the point, and I think that's wonderful, particularly when we're trying to communicate with the public as well and win hearts and minds. We need to be accessible in that way. So that was great, thank you. So, and all the links that people have been talking about and some extra ones so we can follow your work have been shared in the chat, so have a look at those. So I hope this session and the other fantastic sessions we've had during this weekend have inspired some of the healthcare workers here to maybe get involved with campaigning with MedAct. I was asked to say something about why I'm involved in MedAct, and thinking about that, I was struck by something that Goody Singh said in the first session yesterday about a lot of the day-to-day work of healthcare professionals really being the icing on the cake when it comes to health. And I thought, especially when it comes to my work as a GP, that's absolutely right. The prescribing, the managing illness is the icing on the cake. Health is healthy homes, healthy jobs, healthy communities, healthy environments. And for me, involvement in MedAct is a way of being a bit involved in solving the bigger picture of health rather than just my little silo. So that's what it does for me, and I hope some people will look MedAct up if you haven't already, and join one of the Zoom meetings and meet some people and listen to some new ideas. That would be great.